talking about motivation, chapter 8, maybe. There we go. Okay. Self-enhancement is the motivation to view oneself positively. Research reveals that people apparently have a strong need to view themselves in a positive light. Self-esteem is the positivity of your overall evaluation of yourself. In a study done in Canada in 1999, Heine and colleagues, of course Heine is the author of your text, found that 93% of European Canadians had self-esteem scores that were above the midpoint of the scale. Self-serving biases are tendencies for people to exaggerate how good they think they are. And of course, this is me looking into a mirror. A downward social comparison is when we compare ourselves to someone who is worse off than us. We're seeking to form a favorable comparison that casts our own performance in a positive light. When a setback occurs, the individual can focus on and perhaps exaggerate how good they are at something unrelated to their setback, compensating for the pain of failure. He's doing push-ups and doing a Rubik's Cube at the same time. They can self-enhance by recruiting other kinds of positive thoughts. I may have flunked that psych test, but at least I can do one-handed push-ups and a Rubik's Cube at the same time. Discounting is reducing the perceived importance of the domain in which an individual performed badly. People might attribute the cause of their actions to something outside themselves, external attribution, in contrast to an internal attribution, where they see the cause as within themselves. Some people dissipate their personal failures by basking in the reflected glory of a successful group they identify with. Research seems to show that European Americans, even at a young age, tend to maintain fairly high self-enhancing motivations. Trop and Wright in 2003 found that preschool and elementary school European American children chose self-enhancing images at 92% compared to a similar group of Mexican American students at 82%. When Freiberg and Marcus in 2003 looked at a group of elementary school Native Americans, they found that less than half made positive statements about themselves. The authors saw these results as consistent with the understanding that Native Americans are less independent, and independence is related to self-enhancement. This did not prove true of the collectivist Maori of New Zealand. It did not prove true of African Americans. This did not prove true of Israeli Druze. Druze are kind of an interesting religious group and ethnic group. The Druze are kind of a cross between Christians and Jewish people. You really need to look them up. They're really fascinating people. This did not prove true of Asian Indians. 93% of European Canadians have high self-esteem. 55% of Japanese Canadians have high self-esteem. Masses of research show that Americans find success more memorable, probably because they think more about them, and Japanese tend to find failures more memorable because they think more about them. After failing at a task, North Americans tend to discount the importance of the task. Japanese will view the task as even more important if they fail. Americans tend to bask in the reflected glory of their sports teams, while the Japanese are more likely to be critical of their local team as the opposition. Heine and others have speculated that East Asians are just as motivated as Westerners to evaluate themselves positively, merely as their group selves instead of their individual selves. East Asians like themselves as much as Westerners, but seem to be more self-critical of their competence. One of the phenomena of Craigslist and eBay is the endowment effect. Westerners tend to value something more after they own it, which makes them inflate the prices they are asking for their junk. We see the opposite effect with East Asians. Miller and her colleagues looked at children's stories in the United States and Taiwan. They found a marked difference. American stories focused the children's attention on their strengths, while Taiwanese stories focused on areas that needed correcting. And these, of course, are Taiwanese children. European American parents viewed self-esteem as central to child rearing. Taiwanese parents expressed the belief that too much self-esteem can lead to frustration when things aren't working out well for the children. Research shows that the notion of individual selves didn't emerge in Western literature until the 12th century. At this point, the Christian concept of the Last Judgment changed from being an issue of the salvation of collectives to the salvation of individual souls. With the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, many Protestant sects maintained a belief in predestination, or the idea that one's fate was determined before birth. This gave people a great drive to enhance themselves, as that proved that they were one of God's chosen people. Face is a strong Eastern idea that rarely registers among Westerners. Face has been defined as the amount of social value others give you if you live up to the standards associated with your position. The higher your social position, the greater the amount of face available to you. If others grant you face, you'll enjoy all the prerequisites that come with the enhanced status and power. One characteristic of face is that it's more easily lost than gained. The amount of face an individual has access to is determined by position, thus increasing face can only be increased with promotion. While face is difficult to enhance, face is lost whenever individuals fail to live up to the standards of their roles. Face is always vulnerable, and because others determine a person's face, people must count on the goodwill of others to be able to maintain their face. Since face is so easily lost, one strategy is for people to adopt a cautious approach and try to ensure that they are not acting in a way that might lead others to reject them. This approach is known as prevention orientation, being defensive and cautious. Prevention orientation is contrasted with promotion orientation, where the individual is more concerned with advancing themselves and aspiring for gains. Prevention seeks to avoid bad things, while promotion seeks to secure good things. Canadian and Japanese participants were given a faux test that they failed. They were given a chance to either work on their problems or focus on their successes in the test. Canadian participants chose to focus on the things that they did well, promotion focus. In the same study, the Japanese participants maintained a more prevention focus. They were more interested in working on things they did poorly, apparently so they could improve themselves and be less likely to fail in the future. This self-improvement motivation, a desire to seek out potential weaknesses and work on correcting them, is strong motivation in East Asian contexts. Eastern and Western cultures deal with strengths and weaknesses differently. East Asian parents are more likely to call their children's attention to their weaknesses. Western parents direct their children's attention to their strengths. As East Asians have increased their fortunes, they have become big consumers of brand-name luxury goods. Purchasing and displaying brand-name goods can increase face. A key motivation for these acquisitions is to achieve social recognition. In 1904-1905, Max Weber, who was a sociologist, printed a controversial but influential series of essays entitled The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Weber attempted to determine how capitalism was able to emerge from the traditional economics of medieval Europe. Before Weber, the prime social idea came from Karl Marx. Marx felt that capitalism was a result of surplus capital that came from the shift from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy. Now you got to remember that Marx lived in the 1840s up through the 1860s and 70s. So Marx actually saw the transition from agriculture to industry. Marx also felt that religion was being used by governments to control the people. Weber viewed capitalism as the product of people's deriving meaning from a particular cultural context. Capitalism grew out of a belief system that was rooted in a number of cultural ideas that began emerging in the 16th and 17th centuries in Western Europe and in North America. The ideas that became the foundation for capitalism were ones that grew out of the Protestant Reformation. Protestants emphasized literacy training more than Catholics so that people would be able to read the Bible for themselves. The industrialized relation that formed between each person and God has been argued to be central to the blossoming of individualism that emerged during the Reformation and continues to influence much of Western society today. Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism, proposed that each individual had a calling, that is, a unique God-given purpose to fulfill during his or her mortal existence. A calling. The idea was that we are all God's servants in the world and that we are each given a specific duty or job to take care of while we tend the planet. God gives each individual the unique skills and capabilities needed to fulfill their calling, and it is incumbent upon individuals to discover their calling. The highest moral duty that individuals were believed to have was to serve God well by working hard at their calling. Luther was able to imbue daily labor with a spiritual significance that had traditionally been reserved for religious activities such as prayer and ritual. Because Protestants came to view work as a spiritual task, they wished to avoid debasing it by holding a casual or unprofessional attitude. Protestants felt that people should take their work very seriously. It was believed that God would not reward those who were doomed to burn in hell. So any sign of material success was perceived as evidence that one was one of the elect. Any accumulated wealth was to be reinvested to further one's efforts and to accumulate even more wealth and evidence of one's status among the elect. So the idea is that if you're a Protestant, you just keep making as much money as you possibly can. And if you make money, then you roll it back into your business and make even more money. So the richer you are, the closer to God you are. Modern capitalism, as Weber viewed it, was thus concerned with the accumulation of wealth for its own sake and not the sake of the material pleasures that it bought. Like a yacht that looks like a volcano. A recent analysis found that Protestants and people living in Protestant societies more generally consider the prospect of being unemployed as more of a blow to their well-being than non-Protestants living in non-Protestant societies do. In the early 21st century, a study revealed that Protestant nations were far more industrialized than their Catholic counterparts, and religious differences accounted for much of that. A degree of individualism exists in Protestant countries compared to other countries. The 6 most individualistic countries in the world are largely Protestant, whereas the least individualistic Western societies are largely Catholic. Countries dominated by various Asian religions also tend to score low in individualism. Pronounced differences in embracing an intrinsic work ethic was observed between Western European Catholics and mainstream Protestants, as evident in a measure of work values. The Protestant ethic has been associated with negative attitudes toward laziness and being overweight. McClelland in 1961 found that Protestant parents expected their children to become self-reliant at an earlier age compared with Catholic parents. McClelland in 1961 investigated the stories written by young boys and found that those written by German Protestants had more evidence of strong achievement motivations than those written by German Catholics. Now, this is really kind of an interesting picture. And the reason I put this is a German town. And German towns, after World War II, many of the buildings in Germany were destroyed, especially the large buildings, and especially if there was a steeple on the building, because if the Americans came through, that's usually where the snipers were, and they usually blew the belfries out of the churches. So Germany, so the state built churches. They replaced the churches. There were always two churches. There was a Catholic church and there was a Protestant church. Now normally they're on opposite ends of the town, but this town has both of them in about the same place. This is the Catholic church. This is the Catholic cathedral. And this is the Kirche. This is the Protestant church. Most Germans are Lutheran, and Lutherans like to build really tall steeples. So that's a Lutheran church in some village in Germany, probably along the Rhine River. That looks like the Rhine River. Anyway, interesting. Ullman, Tannenbaum, and Barr primed a group of Americans and group of Canadians with salvation words or neutral words and then gave them a task to do. Americans who were primed with salvation words worked harder on the task than those who were primed with neutral words. This is a picture of the myth of Sisyphus. The myth of Sisyphus insulted one of the gods, and as punishment, he made him roll a boulder up a hill for eternity. And you would say, well, he just kept rolling it up. Well, that's not what happened. Sisyphus would get almost to the top. He'd almost push the boulder over the top, and then it would come rolling back down. And that was the torture that the god arranged for Sisyphus. So this is a picture of the myth of Sisyphus. And there's old Sisyphus right there, rolling his boulder up the hill. Okay, so what are we talking about? We're talking about Americans who were primed with salvation words worked harder on the task than those who were primed with neutral words. The American results indicate that notions of hard work and salvation are implicitly linked for Americans. This pattern occurred regardless of whether or not the American participants were religious, providing some evidence for Weber's claim that ideas about predestination become secularized and thus part of the American cultural fabric. The Canadian participants did not work any harder when primed with ideas about salvation, suggesting that an implicit link between salvation and working was not evident in Canada. Now you might wonder, why in the world is that? And the answer is because in Canada, they have the Canadian Protestant religion is primarily Anglican. In other words, it's a Church of England, because Canada was controlled by England for the longest period of time, and it's still a Commonwealth of England. And therefore, that religion isn't as strong as all these various denominations of Protestant that are prevalent in the United States. So the Canadians don't have the same connection to their religion. Americans don't have a state religion, so we don't. In the United States, Americans are less likely, or are more likely, if they go to church, then they're more likely to adhere to an idea. In Canada, you don't really have to do that. In England, you don't really have to do that because it's a state religion. Everybody practices it. So you don't have to really listen to the sermons and whatnot. But in the United States, of course, you go voluntarily to church, And because you go voluntarily to church, you're more likely to absorb the verbiage that is being used in the church. Cohn, Kim, and Hudson in 2014 induced male American Protestant, Jews, and Catholics to imagine their sisters in sexual situations. They then had them do sculptures. A weird experiment. Okay, so they imagine their sisters in a sexual situation, Protestants, Jews, and Catholics. The Protestants were judged as working harder on their sculptures than the Jews or the Catholics, or the Protestants not primed with depravity about their sisters. The researchers concluded that it was the depraved thoughts that induced Protestants to work harder to dissipate some of the guilt they felt for seeing their sister in a sexual situation. We can see the world is fixed and beyond our control to change. This is the entity theory of the world. Or we can think of the world as flexible and responsive to our efforts to change it. This is the incremental theory of the world. So we either have an entity theory or an incremental theory. Rathbaum, Weiss, and Snyder in 1982 proposed that there were two ways to gain control of your life. People achieve a sense of primary control by striving to shape existing realities to fit their perceptions, goals, or wishes. Primary control also goes under the related name internal locus of control, influence, and agency. You have control over your life. People achieve a sense of secondary control when they attempt to align themselves with existing realities, leaving the realities unchanged but exerting control over the psychological impact of these realities. Secondary control, also known as adjustment, is related to the construct of an external locus of control. Your desires and goals adjust themselves to what your environment is most likely to provide. Weiss, Rothbaum, and Blackburn in 1984 see many socializing experiences in Japan that lead Japanese to be more comfortable with engaging in secondary control strategies. Japanese infants spend much more time in contact with their mothers and thus learn to adjust themselves to what their mothers are doing. Japanese workers change jobs far less frequently than their Western counterparts, and it is not uncommon for workers to be promised lifetime employment, a system ensuring that employees learn to adjust themselves to whatever demands the company places on them. In a Japanese and American study where workers were asked to recount when they had been helped and when they had helped others, the Americans were better able to recall when they had influenced others. The Japanese recalled far more times when they were assisted than when they helped someone else. And this is what the subway system looks like in Japan. You can see how crowded it is because Tokyo is very, very crowded. There's little emphasis on making choices in life for people from India. Making choices seems to be more difficult for Indians than for Americans. Indians take significantly more time to make choices than do Americans because we're used to it. We're always making choices. Asian Indians don't respond as negatively when they are deprived of the opportunity to choose when compared with Americans. Asian Indians and people from numerous other non-Western cultures also indicate that they have less free choices in their lives compared with North Americans. Choices do not appear to play as large a part in the lives of Asian Indians as North Americans. The more important the action, the more likely Americans were to identify it as a personal choice, whereas for Asian Indians, the more important the action, the less likely they were to view it as a personal choice. When Americans are given an opportunity to choose something, they almost always select the option they prefer. The link between preferences and choices isn't as tight among Asian Indians. They are less likely to choose their favorite option. In learned helplessness, an individual feels that he or she is unable to control or avoid unpleasant events, and the person will suffer from stress and potentially depression. A study by Oettingen and Seligman in 1990 found that East Berliners showed more signs of learned helplessness than the people on the other side of the wall in West Germany because they had no choices. And I was in East Berlin in 1981, 1982. And I can tell you there weren't a lot of choices there. Snib and Marcus in 2005 argue that upper middle class Americans are raised to favor choices and to express themselves through their choices. They learn to respond quite negatively when they believe that they do not have any choice in a situation. Working class Americans grow up learning that much of what people encounter in life is beyond their control, and that a good way to maintain one's independence is to emphasize one's integrity and resilience during tough times. And this is really kind of interesting because I was married to a woman whose father was working class. He worked in a factory, and our ideas of things were very, very different. And I didn't realize that. We both went to the same school. We were reading the same books. But her ideas were very different than mine were. I wanted to make choices. She felt that she didn't have the right to make choices, that she had to go along with whatever was happening. And my brother also married a woman who was from a working class family, and she was exactly the same way. The difference is I divorced my working class wife, and my brother didn't. And my brothers lived in the same town for the last not that long, probably 45, 50 years. As weird as that sounds. But he's lived there and he hasn't been able to leave, despite the fact there was no work there. He had to leave the town in order to find work, but he had to come home every night. So he had to find a job that was close to this town that was dying. And it was dying because the factories were leaving. But his wife wouldn't let him leave, wouldn't let them leave. She wouldn't leave the town. But Ash's work in 1962 showed that Americans were more likely to conform to social pressure than not. 75% of Ash's American subjects conformed on at least one of the 12 trials. Conformity is common. Ash conducted other experiments dealing with conformity and found that there are several consequences to not conform. People might laugh at you. If that's one of the reasons people conform, because they laugh at you. People tend to actively dislike those who won't conform. And of course, nobody wants to be disliked. A meta-analysis of conformity studies show that while Americans show a great deal of conformity, people from collectivistic cultures conform even more, especially when they are conforming to their own in-groups. And that is the end of chapter 8.